Strategies for Change, Journalism, Media Framing and Disability with Catherine Gallagher.
Mentioned I did the Strategies for Change last year, so I was just like the rest of you, and I'm now a graduate of the programme, and it obviously was a very worthwhile use of my time, even just from the point of view of being able to network with ILMI and also with the people that I met on the course. You know, we all have our group chats and, you know, seeing each other on Instagram and stuff and Facebook. And that's, you know, that for me has been a huge part of the movement over the last. Today, we will be literally looking at defining journalism and news, how news is presented, and that includes news values, framing the angles and the slants that can be made and how they're made, human interest framing, challenges in journalism that might explain some of the reasons why some of the representation is problematic, and hopefully by the end, some suggestions and how you can incorporate all this knowledge to control the narrative. There are so many definitions and scholar work and literature on literally this question and defining journalism and defining its roles, its, you know, occupation ideology, what journalism should be, what journalism actually is in reality. And I've just plucked two of my go-to definitions. So Brian McNair says that journalism is the fuel, the raw material of public opinion, and a key tool in its management by elected politicians, lobbyists. We could be lobbyists, remember that. Lobbyists, pressure group activists, for whom journalism provides the essential oxygen of publicity, which enables their causes to be noticed and they hope addressed. That's a bit of a long-winded one, and even at that, it's shortened. But that definition, I use that definition as an example of what journalism can do for you. The second definition is more of a broader audience, you know, bearing the audience in mind. So Ivor Shapiro says that journalism comprises the activities involved in an independent pursuit of accurate information about current or recent events and its original presentation for the public edification. So that's just a fancy way of saying that it should be an independent pursuit of accurate information about current or recent events in, I would say, in as close to the original presentation as possible. And those two definitions essentially break down to that journalism is a supplier of information. It is a resource, a support, and a participant in public life. Journalism as an institution and journalists as professionals are participants in public life. It is a medium or a method. It is a medium of education, enlightenment, and entertainment. Entertainment for good, bad, or indifferent. Of course, journalism can be entertaining for the wrong reasons, and we might discuss some of that later on. And as I said, there is tension between what journalism is and what it actually, there's tension between what journalism should be or what it's dressed up to be and what it actually is. So all of this is well and good what I'm presenting to you. This is a very ideal, especially the second definition, Shapiro's definition, and it's a supplier information, a resource, and a medium. That's a very ideal way of looking at it. Now, having said that, McNair has said elsewhere that journalism is not and never could be a reality. in the first absolute sense. And what he does say is it can be at best only a version of reality. We have to be mindful of that. It's a version of reality and it's constructed according to certain rules or processes. And I think that's something I think Ross had mentioned it, that the images that are presented is not always true and accurate. The pillars of what should underpin the good work of a good journalist, it should have 5 defining functions. So first one, having current or recent events as subject matter. That's pretty straightforward. News is something new, and it has to be current or recent event. Second defining function is you have to bear in mind the breadth of your audience. And this has a few health warnings, I suppose, to it. But the breadth of your audience, obviously, something that happens in Ireland is going to be relevant to Irish readers. We all have echo chambers, whether we like to admit it or not. We all have, particular go-to outlets or go-to journalists or go-to ways of consuming news. So maybe think about who or what are your outlets that you go to. Do you catch your news on Twitter? Do you listen to the radio? I'm a huge fan of radio myself. Do you catch it on the 6 o'clock news, on the 9 o'clock? Do you watch prime time or any of them shows? So bearing in mind what's going to be relevant to your target audience, and audience studies and talking about audiences is a whole other ballgame altogether. And it's not something I necessarily specialize in because it's so separate to what I'm doing, but you do bear in mind what's relevant to your audience. So let's say, your audience can be in niche groups of people as well. So let's say a university student newspaper. So student newspaper in a third level institution. Obviously what happens in the likes of DCU or University Limerick or NUIG, what happens in NUIG in Galway is going to be relevant to the NUIG students. It mightn't be relevant to, a married person in their 40s raising 2 kids. So you have to bear in mind your audience and assess, and is this something that they would be of interest to them. Third defining function, attempted ascertainment of factual accuracy. So that essentially just means at least a very decent attempt to be accurate. And the reason why it says attempted ascertainment is sometimes mistakes are made, and sometimes the information that's presented to a journalist at a given time can turn out to be not accurate. There are certain procedures to generally try and future-proof that from happening. So for instance, if you hear of brand new information and you're not sure, you would try and get at least 2 sources to confirm. So that's either 2 human sources or two documents, 2 pieces of literature. And at that rate, you would probably need a human source as well, like a quote from a person would help with the literature piece, a written text, I should say. So attempted ascertainment of factual accuracy. Number 4, independence. Independence of politicians, which we'll get to later, not being swayed by government or by even local politicians. This unfortunately does happen. It used to happen in Ireland a long time ago, where like a long time ago, where newspapers or periodicals, as they were called, would be set up literally to support a given party. So to support Fianna Fáil or Fine Gael. That shouldn't be the case anymore. But independence of political interference, and ideally independence of the business side of an outlet. And we'll talk later about how the business demands, so literally the financial demands within an outlet, can influence the type of coverage that they publish. But at the very least, independence from politicians, not being swayed to publish something that's inaccurate, that's that's unfair, just because you have a particular lobby group or group of some nature or person that's putting you under pressure to publish something that isn't a good piece of work. And then the fifth and final, although this isn't an exhaustive list, there's plenty of other principles, but the fifth one I have here is that published work must involve original work. That kind of goes without saying, but you would be surprised, although you mightn't be surprised, you probably see this all the time yourself, where you see story breaks in one newspaper, very soon other newspapers pick it up, and they pick it up without tagging on any new information. And that's what we call journalism. You're churning out, you're recycling, you're rehashing old information, and you're trying to present it as new and glossy and as your own original piece of work. That's wrong.
Catherine, I'm just wondering, like, the independent piece, like, would journalists get in trouble if they were politically, like, supporting someone, or supporting a side of some political party, or saying, or quoting, well, not maybe quoting, but like weighing towards somebody that said something within a political party?
Well, it depends. It depends if, first of all, like if someone is like a columnist or an opinion writer, that's that doesn't come with the same weight of responsibility, because it is what it says in the tin. It's a column, which is essentially an opinion piece. For instance, I'm not sure to what it would depend how annoyed or frustrated let's say the board of directors would be, or the editorial team of, let's say, a newspaper. But for instance, the Irish Independent is always accused of being very much anti-Sinn Féin, for instance. And if you were to look at the coverage, I mean, like, I'm not politically aligned to any party. I can't be because of what I do, but you could see subliminally, you could see it. But if that's, let's say, if that's what the editors, if that's what the news agenda, if that's what the newspaper agenda is that we have a particular ethos, or this is what we subscribe to, and what you'll find as well is you should not see any of that in a public service broadcaster. So the likes of RTE, the BBC, commercial news outlets like Virgin Media Television, any newspaper, your News Talks, your Today FMs, your 98 FMs, any of them, they get away, the commercially sensitive, so the commercial, they're like private companies, and they get away with saying a lot more. Like if you go back and you see some of the stuff that some presenters in news talk have said over the course of the pandemic, you know, even about disabled people and people with underlying conditions, you wouldn't hear any of that in RTE. But that's where E can come in and make complaints to the press ombudsman. If you think that something is untoward, you can absolutely complain. But to answer your question, when it comes to politics, at least anyway, if that's what the editorial line is what they call it, the editorial line, if that's what the editors subscribe to, it's not really going to go any further unless people complain about it. If that answers your question, Fiona.
So making a complaint is important. It's something.
If you feel strongly about it, you know, I mean, it has to be a bit more than a hunch. You would have to give examples. You couldn't just say I have a general feeling or there's a general theme. You would have to. I don't know the ins and outs of making the complaint because I haven't done it myself. Maybe I should do more of that. But you would have to, you know, have a thread of evidence of, you know, articles or links to radio pieces, you know, and you'd have to prove yourself, you know, but it would be assessed and looked at, and there are complaints made all the time, but maybe not about, and maybe not enough of what we concern ourselves with. Is that, I can't see anyone on my screen. Is that all right, Fiona?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you.
No problem.
I think that's important too, as disabled activists, and we know we can make a complaint if we're not happy with an article or whatever, and that there is a way of there's a system built in that we can make a complaint.
Yeah, yeah, sorry.
Oh, sorry, Catherine, I just put it. My name's Nicola. I just wonder, I know you can make a complaint to the press office, but you know the way when it's an article, there's often, people will just write comments underneath the article. And I mean, if you're not happy with the newspaper over its kind of moderation or of those comments, can you make a complaint?
That's a very good question. Back when I first started studying journalism, this was a few years ago, but the idea of comments under articles and so on, it was a huge, you know, there's actually quite a lot of, like, you know, discourse, you know, on this topic, and you know, we were always asked, and we'd had to do debates and write essays on being for or against comments. You'll notice, like, some newspapers used to have comments and don't anymore. I think the Irish Independent used to have comments on their website, and they don't anymore. And I was at a conference a few years ago where the then editor-in-chief, Fiona Sheehan, he's still with the paper, he's just not editor-in-chief anymore, but he was at the time, and this came up of threads. Sorry, this came up of, you know, threads and comments. And he said that he got rid of them on the website because he said at the time, I will be staying late at work, later than I usually would have to. I'd be staying up late with our lawyer going through the comments, because on any article, really of any kind, even a very straightforward article, you can see pretty, you know, awful stuff. Yeah. So yeah, like I'm not, like, you would have to maybe take it up with the section editor. If it's like on a news section, you might flag it with the news editor if you can identify. But
sorry, Kathy, journal online, it's only online, it's only a digital newspaper. And I remember there was an article about a disabled woman, and she talks about like how First would enable her to raise her son. And I remember really negative comments. Oh yeah, but you'd expect the state to look after the baby and all this kind of carry on. And anyway, that's just stuck in my mind.
Yeah, and did you know what? Actually, now this is going back a few years ago. At the time, the acting editor of the journal was beside this man, this Fiona Sheehan, and they were both taking a question on that. And on the journal, because the journal stuff can be awful, the comment section can be, some people just click on a headline to just go to the comments. This was the kind of the practice at the time, rightly or wrongly, was that the then editor-in-chief, Christine Bohan, said, we don't look at the comments, because if we look at the comments and we are aware of them, we're responsible for them. So if you don't check them, if you don't see them, you're not liable. Now, it is different. It depends where the comments are. If the comments, did you know the way like articles can be shared on Twitter or Facebook, on social media, the link, people click the link. If the comment is on like Facebook or Twitter, it's technically not, let's say, the online property of the journal or the Independent. It's like the online property of the platform. So Facebook. So if you're to share, like if a journalist or a social media manager shares a link on Facebook about disability allowance or something, and the comments on Facebook under that are, what unfortunately you might expect, that's the responsibility of Facebook to deal with complaints. So, but absolutely, if you were to Google journal.ie complaints, independent.ie complaints, there will always be a way to complain online. When you want to make a genuine objection or complaint about the nature of the coverage, and you feel very strongly about it and you have a case, and it's about the actual coverage, not the comments, then you go to the press ombudsman. But obviously report anything that you see. Platforms do have a little like a report comment toggle, absolutely do that. But it's very complex, unfortunately, and you know what, it's better to turn off comments. If I was an editor now, people can very much raise their opinions in other ways. But then have the other side of it where people say, oh, well, you're not having civic engagement and you're not, you're not engaging with your audience and you're going to suffer as a result of that. Depends what the priority is. But it's very complex. I'm glad you asked it. I'm not sure if I sufficiently answered your question.
Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and because I know we could probably talk about it for the rest of the show.
There's lots. I'm sure there's lots of even open source studies and opinion pieces and all of that. If it's something you're interested in, it's something that's certainly worth going down a rabbit hole. And there's been lots of research on the comment section of journalists who if a journalist wrote an article and if they come from a certain diversity background, if they're there's been lots of research into female journalists and the unfortunate abuse they get in comment sections and other groups of people. There is a lot of work done on it, but it is.
I'll tell you, I remember seeing I know it's not the same thing, but say different kind of journalists I see, right? There are ones who would write reviews for stuff and they but it turns out a lot of their work they've written and stuff over the years was plagiarized, right? But there was another one, like I think a trans woman who made some mistakes, say when researching something, and received a lot more abuse than say the man who was copying other people's work for years and years, and he was the one complaining more about it. If that makes sense.
I would believe it. Unfortunately, that's how bad things are. I would believe it. Unfortunately, but this is where again, something on the topic of comment sections in media and comment sections and how damaging they can be. This is something, if somebody felt very strongly about it, this is something where a few of you could come together and generate a piece of work that could get published, and that's controlling the narrative. And we'll get to that towards the end of today. But keep these are like what I call gold coins. Keep these gold coins in your memory or jot them down, because these are actually great ideas for opinion pieces and feature articles and investigative pieces as well, if you have the time and the interest. And we'll talk about how you can create news. And something on the topic of this that a few of you feel very strongly about, there's certainly a way to generate and write or record, it could be an audio piece as well, to do a piece of work that will get published that addresses that. So thanks very much for your contributions so far. I look forward to hearing more.
Just one. If there is a time, just one short comment.
Yeah.
It's just I'm asking your personal opinion. Do you think we can talk about independence without thinking about the ownership of the media? Because we know that the media are owned by few very rich people. Sometimes they own 4 or 5 media outlets. So those people usually have their own political inclinations, and we see them reflected in the editorials or something. So without talking about ownership of the media, would it be fair to talk about independence only?
Yeah, that's a very fair comment. As I said, these are the idealistic principles, and idealistic doesn't always happen. Ownership is 100% huge. It's 100%. And in Ireland, some of the commentary and even academic commentary has been that we have a legacy of a very few people owning a lot of media. So look at Dennis O'Brien. He has a hold on the Irish Independent. He had a hold in a lot of commercial radio stations as well. And it's taken a long time for him to back off a bit and to be bought out. Ownership, unfortunately, does come into it. But on the flip side, I have heard editors of outlets say, well, if you are an aspiring journalist and you really don't agree with the business interests or the agendas of certain owners, don't work for them. I know that's not when it's difficult to get a media job in the first place. I'm not sure how helpful that suggestion is, but I know myself before I did a started a PhD when I was in limbo a little bit lockdown. I didn't know if I was doing a PhD or not, or I hadn't applied. I was applying for jobs, but I was avoiding some radio stations in particular because I really didn't agree with the way they operated or the business interests. But that is a very good topic, and I'm glad that you pointed it out. independence, yeah, it can be difficult, and independence of ownership pressures, and also independence of the editorial line of even your section editor, and what your next superior up the chain is looking from you. It is a challenge. So what is news? So we have journalism, we have the occupation definition of journalism, but then what's news? So journalism is like a profession, it's a way of working, and journalism results in news. So Michael Schudson, again, this is probably one of the last quotes, but Michael Schudson, again, is another heavy name in this space. And he said in 2011 that news is the business or practice of regularly producing and disseminating or distributing information about contemporary affairs of public interest and importance. And public interest comes down to your audiences again. And something to think about as well is that sometimes, let's say, when a story is published that a politician isn't happy about, maybe it's something that is on the face of it, something that's more of a private affair, an editor will say, well, you mightn't say it's in the public interest, but it certainly interests the public. So something that's of the public interest, is really important information. It's integral to our decision-making processes, how we vote, how we go about our lives. Think of even COVID, the public health information that was presented in our news wasn't always perfect, and I would probably conclude on that in 2 or 3 years' time, that it certainly wasn't perfect. Public interest, that's what NPHET are saying, what are the Department of Health saying. They're examples of what's of the public interest to us. What we might be interested in, again, has been a common thread of stories over the last couple of years, has been the personal injury claims that even backbench smaller scale politicians make. Now, I won't name any names, but there's been some high profile examples of that. So that would be a story that would be classed as mightn't be super, important to our absolute foundation decision-making process, but it might certainly interest us and it might be a bit entertaining. Now, news values, what makes the cut in news? Because you have to think that there are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of events that happen around the world every day. There are also pseudo events, and pseudo events are events that are just organized and orchestrated so that the media pick up on them. So like Fianna Fáil Ardèche, a press conference by NPHET, that's an example of an event that's set up purposefully for the purpose of for media to pick up and comment on it. So there's lots of good and bad things that happen throughout the world, throughout the country. Not everything can make the cut, because in radio and television there's a certain amount of airtime, and in print there is a certain amount of column space, a certain amount of words that can fit on a page. So Harkup and O'Neill drew up a list of news values about just over 20 years ago. And this is based off them reviewing other momentous papers from the 1960s and 50s that would have first have been, biblical almost for scholars. But they looked at them and they tried to update and improve those list of news values. So what tends to make the cut? Stories about the powerful elite, government, anyone that has a huge decision-making, authority, the powerful elite, the magnitude of a story. How big is it? How many people does it affect? Who does it affect? Where did it happen? Did people get hurt? Is it like a disaster story? A surprise story, something that you wouldn't expect, something completely left field. There's no teeing up to it. There was no leaks. There was no element of surprise. So a surprise story might be a recent story, Tony Houlihan, the story of Tony Houlihan, the CMO here, getting a job in Trinity, and how that was facilitated for is probably putting it politely. There was a huge element of surprise and shock around that story. The next one, relevance. How relevant is it to us, to our community, to our country, to our readers? Is it relevant in general? Is it going to affect people? Believe it or not, some good news stories do make the cut, but they tend to be soft news. They don't tend to be hard news stories. They tend to be soft news with a feel-good factor, and that can be harmful in some instances, and we might discuss why later. But good news stories, it goes without saying. Then bad news obviously sells. Bad news stories, follow-up stories. So stories with a new pieces of information where it's a story that's a thread with topped up information. So again, the Tony Houlihan story is probably a good example of that. Him getting the job in Trinity, the Secretary General of the Department of Health getting caught up in that. Another follow-up was that the Minister for Health, Stephen Donnelly, didn't know. All of these, bullet points almost of updated information are follow-up stories. So a story that continues over a period of time. And finally, although this isn't an exhaustive list, but the newspaper or outlet agenda, as has been discussed, ownership, the editorial line, that does come into it. So I'm glad we talked about ownership and the editorial line, because it does weigh in when it comes to decisions that are made. And news values, these are cultural, but they're reflective, subjective assumptions about what is important to the members of society at a given time. So when a journalist or when I say section editor, I mean like a news editor, a lifestyle editor, a political editor. They're not the editor of the whole page, whole broadcasting station. They look after a certain category of content. Sometimes what an editor thinks is relevant in line with, supposed news values might completely miss the mark with the audience. So these are subjective. And as I said, commercial news media, so that's your news media that has commercial sensitivities. They're not bound by the same media law that the likes of RTE would be bound to. They get away with saying an awful lot more than the likes of RTE would. And commercial news media, they are under significant more financial pressure than the likes of RTE, because they don't get the big lumps of money from government to help them keep them going. They get a little bit in the TV license, a little to them, but they generate a lot of their revenue from subscriptions of readers or consumers of some kind, but also through advertising. And people in advertising, I'm not an expert in advertising, but people in advertising want to place their ads where the most amount of clicks and eyes and ears are going to be. And in order to generate those eyes and ears, eyes and ears and clicks and engagement have to lure you in, because they're under so much more pressure. than their public service colleagues. So commercial news media have values which reflect the need to sell journalism in a marketplace, because that's what it is, a marketplace. Whereas public service media operate news values designed to produce an ideal function of journalism. And again, doesn't mean they're perfect, doesn't mean you can't complain about RTE to the press ombudsman if you find you know, a thread of issues, but they should be, this is me talking hypothetically, but they should be less problematic than some other outlets. So you have your news values, you have your event, you have maybe your sources that you're going to talk to. How do you present it? You have all this information, you have notes, you have maybe transcriptions, you have recordings, you have documents. How are you going to present it? And on the slide, I have two different diagrams. The one on the left is called the inverted pyramid. And this is one of the first things you hear about in any journalism course, is the inverted pyramid. And it's pretty much just an upside down triangle, and it's separated into 3 tiers. So it's kind of like, you know, the food chart that's done in a triangle of, you know, how many food groups should you be eating in a day. It's kind of like the same principle, except this is upside down. And on the first tier, on the first level, what you should be putting at the top of your article. Now, I'm saying article because news writing, if you understand news writing and how like a basic news article is constructed, you'll understand how it could be constructed in any other form. So just for the purposes of illustration, for handiness, I'm just going to talk about a news article. So at the top, you should have your most newsworthy information, comprising of the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how. Who said what? When did they say it? Where did they say it? Why? And how did they say it? How did it come to be that they said a particular statement? Who was affected? What happened? When did it happen? Where did it happen? Why did it happen? And how did it come to happen? And I'm going to come back to the how and the why. The first sentence or the first paragraph of a good news article is called the lead. And it is typically a good lead, a good first paragraph should be no more than 25 words, 25 to 35 words, or sorry, 25 to 30 words, even 30 words is a little bit long. And it should try and answer as many of them who, what, when, where, why, and how as possible. At the very least, it should try and address the who, the what, the when, the where, and get to the why and the how further down. So further down, and the second tier is important details. You're fleshing out more information, the next most important type of information. Then finally, towards the end, anything else that's relevant. Other general background info, you might refer back to a previous story if it's a follow-up story. You might, you know, let's say something is supposed to happen in the future. You might say X, Y, and Z is expected to be finalized next week. That could be your very last sentence of a story. And then on the right-hand side, the is just a diagram of the who, the what, the when, the where, the why, and the how. And it's just 6 connecting circles in order that just connect to each other in that order. And I said I would come back to the why and the how. The why and the how is probably the most difficult to address. Why something happened and how did it happen? So a statement, I'll bring it to disability in a minute, but a basic statement of someone says the grass is wet. Right, that's the statement. Why is the grass wet? It's wet because it rained, a shower, it was pouring all night. Okay, but how did the rain happen? So you go back to your days in geography. I never liked geography, I was always very bad at it. I didn't do it for my leaving cert, I hated it. But if you think back to your geography days, you think back of how clouds form and precipitation, and once the clouds have a certain weight or whatever, it rains. The why, it rained, and that's how we got wet grass. How did it rain? You go back to the process of cloud formation and so on. So to bring it to disability, for instance, and what we concern ourselves with, the statement could be, disabled people are often in risky financial situations, or they're in precarious financial situations. Disabled people tend to be not in very good, wealthy, financial circumstances. That's the statement. Why does that happen? Now, these are just a couple of things you could say. Well, we tend to come from low-income backgrounds. That's one part of the why. So, it's sometimes difficult to get jobs or part-time work, or work that suits us and speaks to our interests. So those are two whys of why something. Okay, that's the why. Okay, but tell me, how does that happen? So you have to go back to the wider context. You have to almost come off the ground and go into a helicopter and look down at the whole scope. The how could be, how do we allow this to happen, that disabled people are in financial, precarious financial situations? The how is means tested supports. How social protection loves to penalise us and to assess us and to conduct really harsh means tests. When it comes to jobs, that's a systemic, cultural, attitude, infrastructure, societal issue. Both of those things, whether it's social protection or it's issues with getting employment or housing or anything like that, the actual why and the how are beyond our control, which is so important that they are referred to. And it's often the most difficult to address in journalism, because it does require an extra bit of space on the page or an extra bit of airtime to address the why and the how. So a very good journalism article or media article should address all of those, but we also have to understand it's sometimes difficult to address it because of the challenges that they face in the job.
So, Catherine, I'm just wondering about the how. So it's looking at like how the journalists or media interpret disability, and it's their understanding of it. So it's where they're getting the information, where they're sourcing it.
Yeah, it comes down to talking to the right people as well. So a journalist, we also have to appreciate that unless a journalist, it comes down to the likes of science and, climate change stories. Journalists is trying to juggle so many different kinds of topics throughout a given day and subjects. They can't be expected to be an expert on everything. But if they talk to the right people, for instance, if they talk to a lot of us here, we could say, well, actually, if you want to read up on it, there was a cost of disability report conducted towards the end of 2021, and you can Google it and find it and read through it, and you can reference to that. So source relations and talking to the right people can be a huge knowledge bank of knowledge to put you in the right direction as a journalist. But the how is really important, but it's also the most difficult. And if the journalist doesn't know what information to go to or who to talk to, and they just talk with the same people. And this comes down to the challenges in journalism, which we'll talk later on. If they talk to the same people that they think are reliable, they're going to hear the same thing. So you have to switch it up. And obviously, again, I don't want to go too much into the presentation for later, but obviously having more disabled journalists or journalists with that are known to be disabled would be a huge benefit to addressing the why and the how, because they would know where to go and they would know who to speak to.
Book. So Catherine, different minority groups. So take the travelers movement. They would directly go to the people with lived experience. The same would go to the Black Lives Matters and campaign. They will go to the person with lived experience. Same goes, with the gay, lesbian, whatever. But they don't go to DPOs.
Mm-hmm.
They go.
I think that's, like, you mightn't believe me, but I think that is very gradually improving over the past year. Even it's very gradually improving, and obviously support the outlets that do it, support the outlets that do it, but a lot of it, and I'm not trying to make excuses for them, but a lot of it comes down to ignorance. The amount of journalists I've spoken to, that said, that I would say, well, you're talking to service providers a lot, or you're talking to people who represent service providers and charities that get a lot of airtime. You're not talking to a DPO, and that ABC is what a DPO is. And a lot of journalists think that some organizations are the likes of a DPO, but they actually aren't, because some organizations can be very clever in how they put themselves forward. It's very easy to make out that you can represent the genuine interests of disabled people, but and if you're presenting that as fact, like this is where it comes to talking to the right people. I do appreciate, and I absolutely do accept, because I'm a disabled person at the end of the day, that certain groups you wouldn't, it's accepted. You wouldn't dream of talking to a straight person about LGBT issues. You wouldn't do that. It doesn't make sense. But I think it's the legacy we have had of family members talking on behalf of their children or adult, sons and daughters and dependents. There's a legacy there, and we're trying to break that legacy. Print, I think, is different to radio. Radio is different to television, online, and social media. I say online and social media, I keep them separate, because online to me is like your independent.ie or your irishtimes.ie website, where the coverage and the content is there. The social media is a newspaper's Twitter, Facebook, TikTok nowadays. It's the platforms that they distribute their content and information. But the different formats, news is like your straight news. A feature is longer than a news item, and it's, it tends to be focused on a particular area. So something like a feature idea would be like the cost of disability. Why is it so huge for every disabled person in the country? Or feature could be transport links in the likes of Achill Island, where I'm from. There's pretty much none. Transport links, something that has a wider context, but there isn't usually enough time or space to deal with it in items of the day. items of the day are typically what your news items are. So something happens on a given day or a given week, and that's pretty much it. Or unless it's a follow-on story, a follow-up story where it goes on over time. Opinion and a column. I'm just going to check the chat. Oh yes, thank you for that. Opinion and column, understanding that opinion and column writers can get away with saying things that a news journalist wouldn't be able to. Editorial, as we mentioned already, that's the editor of the paper. It's typically on, it depends on the publication. It's actually usually, in some newspapers, it's clumped in kind of in the middle of the paper, along with letters to the editor. A letter to the editor is actually a very good example of raising a complaint, actually. And people love to do that in letters to the editor. It's a way of kind of having your voice heard in a sense, but letters to the editor, like everything else, there's a certain amount of space and they have to be picked to be published. So just bear that in mind. And then reviews are like your television reviews, your film reviews, book reviews. Again, that's another thing, you could do, and I'm not going to elaborate on that too much because that's coming towards the end of today. We'll be talking about how you can get published and so on. So very briefly, the media landscape in Ireland, like a bird's eye view at what the media system looks like here. So we have typically, in an idealistic sense, again, comes with a health warning, we ideally have a liberal media model. And the liberal, so there's 6 kind of icons, or there's 6 kind of bullet points I essentially have just dotted around the PowerPoint. And the liberal media model is one of the 6, and the remaining 5 is what follows on, or what is incorporated in a liberal media model. Liberal media model, it's a bit of a tongue twister. So in a liberal media model, you should have high levels of professionalism. So that's professional journalists. They might have a university degree, or be trained in some kind of a way, especially now. There's challenges in that, as we can appreciate. Low political parallelism. That just means not being in cahoots. In this what political parallelism means is not to be in cahoots, not to be in close quarters with the likes of a government or a political party. Because this used to happen a long time ago, and it still happens in some countries. Italy would be an example of a country that has a very well-known reputation in some circles for this, for instance. Following on from that, pluralist of voices. That means that we should see a diverse range of perspectives in sourcing, although we understand that doesn't always happen. Opinion writers in the likes of the Irish Independent but the Irish Times would describe themselves as a paper of record and a paper with pluralist voices, which means that you would have people working in the Irish Times as an organisation with different belief systems. Again, we cannot necessarily prove that. It's an idealistic notion, but that's what we should see. The second last item is a competitive newspaper market. So that's all of your newspapers. They're competitive because they're under financial pressure, which it means that they all have to stay on their game, but it can mean that they end up resorting to stories that are not ideal just to grab attention. And then finally, low polarization levels. Typically, idealistically, that that's like your Fox News and, you know, America. Like America actually, the US is actually clumped in the liberal media model, but that's coming from the early 2000s. This is a model that actually came out in 2004 by two guys called Hallan and Mancini. And it's a model that does need to be revisited because you could not say a lot of these about America anymore, unfortunately. But a lot of these, especially the high levels of professionalization and political parallelism, is more or less true here, and a competitive newspaper market. Polarization just means, you know, one extreme to the other, extreme right, extreme left. We should not see that in Irish media. And one of the reasons that we have low polarization levels is because of RTE. It's because of how big RTE is. It's public service. It shouldn't be one or the other. It should be in the middle. And because it dominates so much of the media consumption here, it evens out anywhere else. I'm not saying that's a good thing or it's a bad thing, but that's how that's calculated for us, is because of RTE. Now, the next two slides are, well, these next couple of slides are what I just want to have enough time to touch on. Framing. This is kind of my baby, is framing. It's one of the areas that I hope to specialize in, is framing. In layman's terms, in simpler terms, it means the slant that's put on something. So framing relates to how elements of an issue are emphasized. How it is then presented in a news item can influence how it is interpreted by the receiver. So it's emphasizing certain parts of a story in a particular way on purpose. That's not inherently a bad thing. It's not inherently a good thing. But a lot of framing, especially game strategy framing and human interest framing, which we'll get into, those three, a lot of them come from points of view, or they come from outlets that are under a lot of financial pressure because they have to be grabby, they have to grab your attention to get their advertisements, because that's what people in advertising want. They want plenty of eyes and ears and clicks. But firstly, we have something called issue framing. And this is where you place stories in the context of a wider policy issue or solution. They don't tend to be, sensational or untoward. When I describe issue framing, I describe it in the context of insurance, for instance. So a couple of years ago, the price of insurance premiums was huge, and businesses going out of business because they couldn't afford their business insurance premiums, and people not being able to afford health insurance and so on. And what you saw was, and I know I mentioned it earlier, but what you saw was a steady thread of stories about personal injury claims and how personal injury claims and the payouts that people get. Anyone can take a personal claim. Anyone can. There's no law against doing that. But how they drive up, how compensations from personal injury claims, So a story of that would be in your local paper, for instance. Your local pub or bar or cafe has gone out of business, but the reason that they've gone out of business is because they can't afford their insurance. This was actually particularly the case for like outdoor pursuits type businesses where there's a high risk of injury, as you can appreciate, public liability. That's what an issue frame is. It's tying it to a policy or a legislative issue. Game framing, also known as horse race framing, someone is winning and someone is losing. stories around winning and losing, language of war. It will include opinion polls, opinions, vox pops, so like little snippets from the general public and they're going about their business. You typically see this in general election coverage, or if there's a very big tit for tat between the government and opposition parties on a particular issue, you'll see it play out as one day, you know, the government takes a swipe at opposition, next day, opposition takes a swipe at government. That's how it works. And it's entertaining and it's a circus. So that's why it's called a horse race. Strategy framing is quite similar to game framing, but it's a little bit of a branch off it. It's stories that predict outcomes. They analyze tactics, strategies, and personalities. They are speculative, and publishing leaks would be a very good example of a strategy frame. So you might recall letters or plans of NEFIT before. Again, I'm using NEFIT and COVID as some examples because that's what I look at every day. But that would be an example, or text messages, or you know, anything like, you know, if you remember like last year, like the Catherine stuff, or her party, you know, that would be after she got her job with the United Nations, she had this party and she got in a lot of trouble. That would be an example of a strategy frame. And what we are going to look at a little bit further is the human interest frame. Stories that typically use stories of private citizens in the context of a wider issue. They tend to be emotional in tone, and they tend to be a feature style. Not always, sometimes they can be news. And typically this is where a lot of disability related stories have fallen under, where they use an individual, family, or child, or parent of a child, or adult individual to highlight a wider issue. And the individual, let's say, that's interviewed, or it could be multiple individuals, and they're talking about their personal, very personal stories, and it's the language in it, as I said, is very emotive. The people that are interviewed for that are called exemplars, and they're exemplified. So human interest framing, there's only a couple more slides and then we might go into breakout rooms in a minute. Human interest framing involves the use of individuals, as I said, private citizens, also known as exemplars. These are private individuals' personal experience to highlight a wider issue in society. These stories often result in readers attributing the responsibility of the portrayed problem to the government. So while they can be, you know, the reason why I think a lot of people participate in this type of story is sometimes they can be effective. They tend to have two main effects. Number one, as I just said, let's say in the case of medical cards or disability allowance, something is portrayed in an emotive way, and you have a very real life example. It's effective objectively taking my disabled hat off on. Now, if bearing in mind, it's effective in that usually audiences say, but that isn't, well, a decent sounded minded person would attribute the fault or the blame to the government. That would be the first result. The second result would be that they would not support any further actions that could make that situation worse. So like budget cuts, further budget cuts, that would be the second effect. They would blame the government, and they also wouldn't approve of the government making the situation any worse. And that was based off an Irish study that was done by Dawn Wheatley just within the last year or so. It features often on the part of journalists then, in a very crude sense, it's cheap. It's a cheap resource to talk to someone on the phone or over email or over voice message. And it's an accessible resource for them. Typically, sources that you talk to for a story shouldn't be paid because that's like not ethical. So it's a cheap and accessible resource. As I said, it's typically presented in a feature format. But having said that, it can impact on knowledge and information. They are often not very informative. I can't say for all of them, I can't speak for all human interest stories, but they typically don't address the how and the why that we covered earlier, the wider context, the why something is happening and how is it happening. And why some disabled people participate, as I said, some people may feel it's the only way they can be heard. For to think about some things we've seen over the last number of years, just think about, we won't discuss it right now, but just think about, could this type of framing affect the disability movement? How or why not? How could it? And if you don't think it does affect, because we were all entitled to an opinion, why would it not? Why do you think that this kind of framing wouldn't affect us in a negative way? Now, challenges in journalism. Again, I've covered a lot of this.
Sorry, Catherine.
Yeah.
Just maybe this fits with what you're saying so far about framing. I just want to mention one experience I had a few years ago. I was reading this opinion piece by Kevin Myers on the Irish Independent, and one sentence, it was not about disability actually, the whole piece, but one sentence kind of kept stuck with me. He said, any family who lost an undisabled member of family would be grieved. So I contacted the Irish Independent, the editor team, and I kind of mentioned that this has the implication that families who actually lose disabled members, this could be, because I felt that, including the way he framed it, including a non-disabled member of family, it felt like as if families wouldn't be bothered if a disabled member of family kind of passes away. So I thought that framing is just, it's not an accidental or something, it is, because for me, it's just, it doesn't make sense to add families who lose a non-disabled member of family. He could have said families who lose a member of family would grieve a lot. So the response I got was that he didn't say families who lose a disabled member of family would not grieve. So they were telling me that because he didn't directly say the loss of disabled members of family wouldn't be that influential, or wouldn't be that impactful. So I thought that kind of framing was a bit not fair for people with disabilities. And I even brought it to the attention of, I don't want to mention DPO, who did not take it up, but it happened several years ago, and it kind of stuck with me still. And would you say, if I repeat to you the sentence, like families who lose a non-disabled member of family would grieve a lot, wouldn't you say that that's a kind of framing which is not fair to disabled people?
Yeah, I think people who write columns or write news articles have to be aware that they're in a privileged position that they have a platform with their words or with their opinions, and that they you know, as so far as is possible, that they have to, like, it's an objectively awful thing to say. Of course, I would have to see, like, obviously I don't agree with it, but I would have to see if you're comfortable with sending me the link privately to that piece, maybe, or emailing it to me. I can have a look at it. I just want to understand, not that I'm condoning, I'm just trying to see how he got away with saying something like that.
It's grief, not grief.
Grief is grief.
Yeah, that was what I thought.
Regardless of impairment or not impairment, grief is grief.
Yeah.
In my head, anyone, Michael. So I don't think it's less or more or less than any. You know, grief is it's a human experience, you know, and it shouldn't be more or less for any type of person. And
And when it comes to recognizing the platform that an individual has, you know, if someone says, right, well, I'm going to write something, they have to, a good, you know, self-aware person will say, well, I have this platform, I need to be, you know, conscious of my words. And I also need to bear in mind that this is going to kind of old school in that who is going to benefit from what I say or what I publish, and who is going to be harmed. And I think this doesn't, it can't come into framing. It doesn't come into the categories that I've outlined there, but it comes down to certainly to an ethical and a principle issue of words, and it's quite clear that that person did not think long enough, or didn't think at all about who will I harm if I include this sentence in my piece. So I don't agree with it, and I'm surprised that it was. I would be curious to see where it was published, but you don't have to share that with me. But if you want to, even privately, you're welcome to. But and I will take.
I will check the archives and try to find it and send it to you.
Great, thank you. Although it could be gone, you know, it could be deleted off the internet, you wouldn't know. With any luck, it actually might be gone. So human interest framing, and very briefly, I've touched on some of this already. The challenges in journalism, there's challenges in every industry. The workload, the sheer workload, especially now, like often the journalist has to write a text piece, has to produce an audio piece, maybe have a radio, an audio, which is radio, a radio piece, a video piece for social media, and has to distribute it on their personal, you know, work, personal/work social media. So now the toolkit that any journalist is expected to have now in comparison to 20 years ago is far different. There's less people working in a given organization than there was 20, 30, 40 years ago. So there's a lot more work, and there's less people, less hands on deck. So the workload is immense. Pressure with turnover time and resources. Turnover time is just the deadline that something has to be finished. And this is some of the reason why a journalist or a producer in a radio station might contact the same people, the same voices, because they're quote unquote reliable, they're always available, and they're fit to talk. And they're known for talking, and they're known for being able to react quickly. This is especially the case in broadcasting, where things are live and they can change in any given minute. So what you might find in radio or television, same like people from service providers or charities are brought on because there's a long-standing relationship there. They're reliable for having like a good phone line connection. I know that might sound silly, but they might be known for having a good landline or a good internet connection for Zoom, or they're known for being on time to come into the studio. They're known for loving the microphone and being able to produce a soundbite. money and commercial sensitivities, I've dealt with that quite a lot. And lack of disabled people working in the industry, obviously, and this is something that we don't have enough research on. But this is absolutely an area that would be a great idea to do a feature piece, an investigative piece. I tried to find figures for an Irish context on the number of people working in media in Ireland that are disabled, and there are, like, the knowledge and the data gaps on this are quite unbelievable. I did contact the NUJ, which is like a global kind of trade union it's just the National Union of Journalists, and they have a branch in Ireland, and I contacted them to see, do they have any information, any kind of initiatives for disabled journalists and media people in Ireland. I haven't received a response yet in time, but if I do, I will forward that on to Fiona. It would be great if they did have an initiative, although if they did, I would have heard about it, because in the wider NUJ outside of the Irish branch, if you look up NUJ and like disability and disabled members, you'll be brought to like an equality page, and the wider organisation of NUJ actually subscribe to the social model of disability for their members, and they're particularly strong on this in the UK. We just need to see this replicated in Ireland. They have a DMC, which is their Disabled Members Council, and the UK seem to be a lot more ahead on initiatives and research on this than we are here. So that's certainly something that even an opinion piece on that could be done. How you can control the narrative. How can you get yourself into a newspaper, a radio station? How can you get in there pretty much, either yourselves as an individual, yourselves as a group or a working group. So the first thing I would do is to discuss the approach and angle with the journalist or producer. If you're particularly cautious of human interest framing with that very strong emotive slant, that isn't going to be super informative. Unfortunately for the reader, it's going to tell a story of an individual, but it might not link it enough to the how and the why of how that story came to be. So don't be afraid to discuss the approach and angle with the journalist or with the producer who's contacting you to participate in a radio or a television program. And this happened to me not too long ago. I was approached for a segment of a television show, and it was to do with cocooning. And I said, I can comment, objectively and generally on the narrative of cocooning and the discourse around it. I'm not too comfortable talking about my own personal circumstance. And that's all they wanted. They wanted my personal, they did want a human interest frame, and they wanted me to film in my home and all of that. And I just wasn't comfortable with it. So I explained why I wasn't comfortable, and I passed it up. And that's about taking back control as well. And you mightn't think, if you say no to an opportunity like that, you might think you're not actually doing anything, but you actually are. You're sending a message. You're saying, I'm not really, I'm not really okay with that. I'm not going to participate. Thanks very much. And what I would say is, the way I would handle a situation like that would be, I'd say, thanks very much for contacting me, for thinking of me. I'm not comfortable with the approach that you're going about it. I'm not telling you how to do your job. I'm just personally not comfortable with it. If something else comes up that you think might align with what I'm happy with, what I'm comfortable with, please let me know. Either if it's yourself that's covering it or a colleague, pass around my contact details, or contact me again if you think you're going to cover something that might, that I might agree to participating with. And that's saying no, but also keeping your foot in the door in case anything changes. Write for media. That's writing opinion pieces, reviews, letters to the editor. You can even set up your own blog this evening if you wanted and start publishing on your own bat. Writing features. Even if you were to say, okay, well, we want to do a bit of a deep dive into the comments section of news websites. We want to do something on that. We want to do a little bit of research. You want to do a bit of research for that. You want to talk to key people, maybe scholars or experts, and we want to talk to maybe people who are affected by comment sections. And that wouldn't necessarily be a human interest frame because you're talking about the wider issue and you do have to talk to people in a feature. But that's a lot of work for one person. So what you might see is, okay, we're going to come together as a group and we're going to have a shared byline. That's done all the time. A lot of the big breaking news stories you'll see on newspapers is like, by Philip Ryan and who else is there? By Philip Ryan and Senan Maloney. By Pat Leahy and Jack Powers. A lot of big stories are actually broken by and published by more than one person working on it. So that actually leads me to the next point. Are you solo or are you part of a group? And how will you, if you're a part of a group, how will you distribute the workload? So is someone particularly good on the research? Is someone particularly good at doing interviewing? Is someone like me finds transcribing interviews very relaxing and is going to take over that role? You'd still get a byline out of doing that donkey work, I can tell you. Is someone good at data? If you get a hold of Excel sheets, or literally do a brain dump of all the particular skills of strengths that are in the group, and delegate the workload based on that, and have people's availability and so on. So, the best way to control the narrative is to actually generate news of your own. Hosting events. So hosting, maybe for instance, you want to host an event talking about the challenges of, or talking about disabled people working in Irish media. You want to hold like a little webinar or conference, and you might say, okay, well, we're going to partner up with, there's going to be ourselves as a group or ourselves as ILMI, and we're going to partner with the NUJ branch in Ireland, the National Union of Journalists in Ireland. We're going to get them guys up to speed on, what needs to be done. We're going to get their support. We're going to build up a relationship. We're going to host an event that will generate news. There will be absolutely, if the NUJ is involved or any kind of relevant organisation like that, you'll have media pick up. Now, say you'll give out press releases in advance of an event. That's one way to generate news. Publishing research or new discoveries. If you can say something that's new or present something new that hasn't been said or found before, that's the best way to get interest from an editor or a section editor. Write columns or opinions, 100%. The Irish Examiner and the Irish Times are particularly receptive to pieces like that. Pitch features, like I said earlier, and follow up on existing reports. So for instance, you see a story it's to do with disability. It hasn't addressed the how and the why. Excuse me. I'm going to stop talking now in a second. It hasn't addressed the how and the why, but you know where to get that information. So you or yourselves as a group would, if you know where to get the how and the why, you go off and do that research, write it up, and present it to the relevant section editor, and that would be a follow-up story to something that's already been published, and that's keeping it relevant, and it's teeing up a story as well. And then finally, just some suggestions of disabled journalists to follow. If you're on Twitter or Instagram, I personally follow all of these people. Alice Palmer from the BBC, who has given kind of the equivalent of this presentation or talk to last year's Strategies for Change. Bridget O'Dea is a columnist with the Irish Times. Leavni Hira Third, if I'm pronouncing that right, she's freelance. Someone might correct me on the pronunciation of that, please. Frances Ryan from The Guardian is amazing. And Louise Bruton, who is freelance, but she's on Twitter a lot.